Hello, all you lovely people, and welcome back once again to my podcast, Breaking Stereotypes. In this series, we have been taking a look into how different crime TV shows portray women in sex work. Now, this episode today is a bit of a longer one than usual, but it's packed full of lots of really fun, interesting, and even educational tidbits, so buckle up and get ready for an exciting ride. I know I say this at the beginning of most podcasts, but I think it is always a good reminder for us, myself included, to keep in the back of our heads, and that is that people's identities are not solely based on their gender, race, sexual orientation, or religion, and people are also not solely defined by their jobs, and this should be no different for those who are involved in sex work. Now, we have already analyzed episodes of Law & Order SVU and Criminal Minds and have decided that overall, these two shows do a pretty decent job at portraying women in this line of work in some form of positive light, but for both shows, there's still room for improvement. Today, we are going to be reviewing the show NCIS, and the episode that I have chosen to do for this is a bit different than the two that we have previously discussed. The specific episode we're going to be taking a look into today is from Season 7, Episode 19, called Guilty Pleasure. Now, this particular episode ended up being much more enjoyable for me than I had originally anticipated. I hadn't watched an episode of NCIS since probably my freshman year of high school 7 years ago, which, wow, makes me feel so old saying that. So it was really fascinating to get to go back and watch it again, once just for pleasure so I could refresh myself about the show, but then going back the second time and watching it with a very different viewing lens, particularly one that is more tailored to this podcast. Now, the main difference between this episode of NCIS and the episodes of Criminal Minds and SVU that we have already unpacked is that this particular episode of NCIS, the crime that the escorts commit is not at all crucial to the main plot line of the story. And what I mean by that is, while the escorts still are very crucial to what is going on in the episode, it does not centrally focus on the crimes that they have committed as escorts, and that's not the main thing that is being highlighted as wrong in this episode. In fact, in this particular episode, the detectives heavily rely on the help from one former escort, Holly, and one current escort, Charlotte. Basically, in this episode, multiple men that Holly had been seeing as an escort had recently turned up dead, and they needed the help of her former employer, Holly, to track down Charlotte in hopes of getting to the bottom of why these men are being killed. Now, Charlotte quickly becomes cleared as a suspect in this episode and then just sticks around to help out the detectives in getting to the bottom of the case. Now, what's interesting about the character Holly is that she is part of a program where she teaches people, specifically people who work in corporate jobs, about sexual harassment in the workplace, and she does this as one of her probation terms for previously getting arrested for prostitution. And I think this particular detail of the show was especially enlightening and helpful because it gave a really visible example of how recovery programs could often, if not the majority of the times, be a much more suitable term for women who do get busted for prostitution or being an escort, rather than just throwing them in jail without a second thought. I think that the more that shows like this portray women in sex work and rehabilitation and redemption programs creates much more room for us as viewers for empathy and compassion towards these types of women. The detectives are also very compassionate towards the current working escort, Charlotte, and it is very clear to see that they uphold her safety as the top priority, regardless of the work that she does for a living or regardless of some of her lifestyle choices that the detectives may not necessarily agree with. They're able to set aside their biases in hopes of helping these women achieve both redemption for themselves and by helping the men that have been murdered receive justice. I honestly cannot stress enough how important and noteworthy it is for shows like this to depict women in sex work in a more positive light, because this will have a natural domino effect, leading the audience to adopt these similar and more positive attitudes towards escorts or prostitutes. Now, I'm going to take a brief minute and let y'all in on a little secret about something here. There's actually a technical term for what I've kind of been saying and describing about how these particular shows, especially this episode of NCIS, can help shape and form our attitudes as a society. And this is called the social cognitive theory. Now, before you all instantly tune out this section or just switch off the podcast because you think I'm about to start talking about educational and technical wording, I would highly encourage all of you to keep listening because this is a very real phenomenon. And hey, it can never hurt to whip out some new smart-sounding vocabulary in front of your friends or families to show that your degree is going to use. Really, if you can get past the technical jargon of it, it's a very plain and simple theory to understand. The social cognitive theory essentially just states that we learn and pick up on certain attitudes and behaviors from the environment surrounding us and the environment that we grow up in. And in today's society in particular, the media plays a massive role in helping us form these attitudes and beliefs that are central to us. This is why when we see women like prostitutes and escorts constantly being portrayed in the media and on TV in a negative light, we naturally, whether it's conscious or unconscious, start to view these women in a negative light in real life. I think if we're able to understand this theory and this phenomenon, we will be able to be more conscientious about not letting shows or media have such a direct and heavy influence on what we believe without giving it a second thought. Basically, all I'm trying to say is don't just watch shows like this or take everything that you see and hear on the media at surface value. I would encourage y'all and myself to really take the time to see what the hidden messages are in these forms of media, take them captive, and decide if this is an attitude that we truly want to adopt for ourselves and put out into the world. And if it's not, we should not let it have control over us. If we can all get on board with this, we will be able to take huge steps as a society to creating attitudes that are more compassionate, forgiving, and humane towards women that are involved in sex work. If you stuck with me through that brief educational segment, I appreciate you, first of all, and hey, you learn something new every day, so if nothing else, you can at least say that. Now, getting more back on track with the regularly scheduled podcast, while I do think that NCIS does arguably the best job out of the three of the shows that we have analyzed at portraying women in sex work in a more different and positive light, there are still some lingering negative stereotypes that it put out that I think we need to be aware of. For one, Charlotte and Holly, the two escorts, are referred to multiple times as tramps or skanks. I think we can all agree that these can be pretty commonly held views about escorts and prostitutes in our society today. And while I recognize that some of that language might have been necessary for plot development of the show, I still think that this derogatory name calling could be greatly cut back, seeing that it still serves to uphold and perpetuate negative stereotypes. Another central point of the episode that isn't inherently bad, but is definitely something that we should be aware of as viewers, is Holly's whole involvement throughout this whole episode. Now, there is a bit of a spoiler alert coming up with this, so consider this your fair warning and apology. But in the end, we do come to learn that Holly's boyfriend was the murderer of the men, and his motives behind doing so were that he was angry and unapproving of what Holly did for work as an escort, and he was jealous that he was not the man in her life. He was not the only man in her life. Important note there. Ultimately, we learn that Holly's boyfriend looked down on her for what she did for work, and because of this work, he did not view her as a full person that was worthy of respect or equal treatment. Now, I know that the whole plot line of this show is kind of based around her boyfriend being the murderer, and it wouldn't really make sense for him to do so if he did not believe the way that he did about Holly and escorts in general. I just think that it is important for us to make a conscious note of this view and treatment towards Holly so that we can be sure to actively avoid adopting similar negative and potentially very harmful views. Now, folks, here comes the part that I know we've all been waiting for, my very professional an incredibly official rating of how this show portrays women in sex work and how well it does at doing so in a positive light. So without further ado, I give NCIS a drumroll please, 9 out of 10, the best rating that I've given thus far in this new series. NCIS, I applaud you for breaking from the norm about how female sex work characters are usually portrayed and created in crime shows. While I do think this show could still use to cut back on some of the derogatory slurs that are used towards these women, I think that it did an overall fantastic job at showing how escorts like Holly and Charlotte do not need to be solely defined and identified based on the work that they currently do or have done in their past. We are able to see that women in lines of work like this can create a new life for themselves that is much healthier and better than the ones that they choose to leave behind. And even if they are not ready to leave that life behind yet, and even if they are still involved in sex work, we are able to see that they are still very capable at contributing and giving back to society, and that above all else, they are still just as deserving of our help and respect. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in, because I truly would not be able to do this podcast without all of you. And a special thank you to those of you who stuck through my brief educational, but in my opinion, also very cool lesson about the social cognitive theory. And I hope you're able to take something away from this podcast more than just pure entertainment. I challenge both you all and myself to go out into the world, look more deeply into the hidden messages of the media we consume, and take just one small step every day towards making our society one that is more equal and compassionate, specifically towards women that are in sex work. Again, I truly cannot thank you all enough for your time, and I can't wait till we're all back together next week. See you guys later.